Imagine you're building a city for 1 million people. Skyscrapers, shopping malls, hospitals, schools, parks. And then nobody shows up. In China, there are dozens of cities like this. Enough empty apartments to house the entire population of France. 65 million housing units, without a single resident. But this isn't just an architectural failure. This is $300 billion in debt hanging on a single company. This is 70% of every Chinese family's savings frozen in concrete. This is 20 million people paying mortgages for apartments that don't exist. And this is a ticking time bomb under the world's second-largest economy. Today we'll break down how China built the biggest real estate bubble in human history, why the government is hiding unemployment statistics, and what will happen to the world when this bubble bursts. Nail number 1. How concrete became a religion. Let's start with a simple question. Why are the Chinese so obsessed with real estate? In 1978, virtually no one in China owned private property. Everything belonged to the state. The average Chinese person was poorer than the average citizen of Chad. Then Deng Xiaoping launched his reforms, and in 40 years, the country traveled a path that took Europe 200 years. But here's the problem. Where do you put all that money you've earned? The stock market? Unstable. The Chinese remember the 2015 crash. Bank deposits? Interest rates below inflation. Cryptocurrencies? Banned. That leaves one option, real estate. And this is where the magic begins. Since the 1990s, apartment prices in major cities have gone up every year. Every single year. No exceptions. Buy an apartment in Shenzhen in 2002 for $160,000. Now it's worth $3.6 million. People stopped buying apartments to live in. They started buying apartments to store money, like gold bars only made of concrete. The result? 70% of Chinese household wealth is in real estate. In the US, 35%. The Chinese literally walled up their savings. 96% of urban families own at least one apartment. 20% own 2 or more. But if everyone's buying and no one's living in them, who's building all these apartments? Nail number 2. A Ponzi scheme, the size of a country. In 1994, Beijing carried out a tax reform. The central government took most of the tax revenue, leaving local authorities with almost nothing. But the expenses, schools, hospitals, roads, stayed with the locals. What do you do when you have no money but you have land? Sell the land. In China, all land belongs to the state. Local governments can lease it to developers. And this is where the madness begins. 60–80% of local government revenue started coming from land sales. To sell land for more, you need to increase its value. To increase value, you need to build. To build, you need to take out loans. To repay loans, you need to sell even more land. See the pattern? But that's not all. Local officials were promoted based on GDP growth in their region. Not quality of life, not environmental standards, not citizens' happiness. Just GDP. And you know what's great for boosting GDP? Construction. Every building adds to the statistics. Doesn't matter if anyone will live in it or not. That's how a machine was born that couldn't stop. Nail number 3. Evergrande. $300 billion in debt. If the Chinese construction boom is the Titanic, then Evergrande is the iceberg. Evergrande Group was China's second-largest developer. More than 1,300 projects in 280 cities, stadiums, theme parks, electric vehicles, bottled water, football clubs. Founder Xu Jiayan was one of the richest people in Asia. But all of it was built on debt, $300 billion in debt. Let me put that in perspective. That's more than the GDP of 85% of countries in the world. That's more than the foreign debt of Argentina, Turkey, and Pakistan combined. How is that even possible? China has a pre-sale system. You buy an apartment before it's built, you pay the full price up front, you take out a mortgage, you start making monthly payments, and the developer uses your money to build your apartment, and 10 other projects, and a stadium, and a theme park. When the money runs out, they sell even more unbuilt apartments. In December 2021, Evergrande declared default. On January 29, 2024, a Hong Kong court ordered its liquidation. Judge Linda Chan said, "It is time for the court to say enough is enough." But 800,000 apartments were never finished. Nail number 4. People living in shells. Let me tell you about Ms. Chu. Ms. Chu lives in her apartment, without gas, without electricity, without running water. Every day she carries water in buckets up several flights of stairs because her apartment is bare concrete, no doors, no windows in some rooms. But she has no choice. She paid everything she had for this apartment, for her son, so he could get married. In China, a man without an apartment is not marriage material. This isn't a joke. The bride's parents demand proof of property ownership before giving their blessing. Now imagine, you took out a mortgage. You've been paying every month for 3 years now, and your apartment doesn't exist. Construction stopped. The developer went bankrupt. The cranes are idle. The site is overgrown with weeds. And you keep paying. 20 million people in China are in exactly this situation, paying mortgages for rotten buildings. That's what they call them in Chinese. One of them, Chen, told journalists, "I'm already socially dead. My life is destroyed." Without an apartment, he can't get married. At 35, he watches his friends move forward in life while he's frozen, legally bound to a phantom apartment. Nail number 5, ghost cities. Now let's take a little trip. Ordos Kangbashi, Inner Mongolia. This district was built in the early 2000s during the coal boom. It was planned for 1 million residents, modern residential complexes, parks, a museum, a library. At its peak, fewer than 30,000 people lived here. 90% of buildings stood empty. Tianducheng, China's Paris. Then he raised his submachine gun with his left hand and continued firing until a bullet hit his leg, and he lost consciousness. Built for 10,000 residents, mostly populated by couples who come for wedding photo shoots. Yujia, China's Manhattan. $30 billion in investment. Skyscrapers modeled after New York. A high-speed rail line to Beijing. 75% of office space sits empty. Many buildings were never completed. State guest mansions. 260 European-style villas in the suburbs of Shenyang. Marble floors, crystal chandeliers, coffered ceilings. Today, local farmers grow vegetables between the villas and graze cattle in what were supposed to be garages for Ferraris. By various estimates, China has 65 to 90 million vacant housing units. He, former deputy head of the National Bureau of Statistics, stated that China has enough empty apartments to house the entire population of the country, 1.4 billion people. Nail number 6, the government that hid the statistics. In June 2023, youth unemployment in China reached 21.3%, a historic record. Know what the government did? Stopped publishing the statistics. The National Bureau of Statistics announced that the data needs improvement and optimization. But the reality is even worse than 21%. Zhang Dandan, economics professor at Peking University, calculated if you count not just those actively looking for work, like China does, but everyone who isn't working, like the US does, actual youth unemployment could reach 46.5%. 16 million young Chinese have simply dropped out of the labor market, and they have a name for it. Nail number 7. Lying flat and let it rot. Tangping, lying flat. This movement started in 2021 when a guy in his mid-20s posted about his desire-free lifestyle. He hadn't worked for 2 years, pursued his hobbies, lived on the minimum. The post went viral. Millions of young Chinese saw themselves in it. Then the censors deleted the post. The phrase Tang Ping was blocked on all Chinese platforms. But the idea didn't die, it evolved. Bailan's let it rot. If lying flat is passive resistance, let it rot is active refusal. Why bother trying in a system that gives you no chance? Imagine, you studied for 16 years, got into university, insane competition, graduated with honors, and now 11.6 million graduates per year, and there aren't enough jobs for everyone. Working 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, they call it 996, and you still can't afford an apartment in the city, can't get married, can't start a family. One young engineer, now working as a movie extra, told the BBC, "Mostly I just stand next to the main character as eye candy." He studied to be a programmer. Xi Jinping called on young people to eat bitterness, meaning accept hard work, go to the countryside, work in factories. The youth responded with memes. But nail number 8, full-time children. There's another phenomenon that says a lot about the state of the economy. Full-time children. These are adults, 25, 30, 35 years old, who live with their parents and do household chores for a salary. Yes, you read that right. Parents pay their adult children to clean the house, cook meals, and do the shopping. Why? Because finding a normal job is impossible. At least this way there's something to do. Zhao Wei, 34, was laid off from a tech company in Beijing. For weeks she pretended she was going to work, leaving in the morning for cafes and libraries so she wouldn't have to explain to her mother-in-law that she was unemployed. Eventually she gave up, and now she's officially lying flat. For a generation that grew up during double-digit GDP growth, this is the collapse of a dream. Their parents rose from poverty to the middle class, bought apartments that increased in value tenfold, but the children can't repeat that path. Nail number 9, 300% debt, and that's just the official number. Let's talk about numbers that make economists' hair stand on end. China's total debt is around 310% of GDP. That's the combined debt of corporations, households, and the government. For comparison, in the US the figure is roughly the same, but the US is a developed economy with the world's reserve currency. China is a middle-income country. Among developing countries, no one has debt levels like this. According to the IMF, China is responsible for more than half of the growth in global debt since 2008. But the problem isn't even the size of the debt. The problem is what it's spent on. In a healthy economy, debt goes toward productive investments, factories, technology, infrastructure that's actually used. These investments generate returns that cover the debt. In China, more and more debt goes toward ghost cities, empty apartments, infrastructure that nobody uses. According to the Carnegie Endowment in 2024, for every unit of GDP growth, China spent 5.5 units of debt. Before the pandemic, that ratio was around 2.5. In other words, the economy grows less and less from more and more debt. Nail number 10. Deflation, worse than inflation. The whole world fought inflation in 2022-2023. Central banks raised rates. People complained about rising prices. China faced the opposite problem. Deflation. When prices fall. Sounds good? Actually, it's a nightmare. When prices fall, consumers delay purchases. It'll be cheaper tomorrow. Companies cut wages and lay off workers. Debts become heavier. You took out a loan at one price level but pay it back at a lower one. The economy enters a deflationary spiral. In February 2025, consumer prices in China fell 0.7% year over year. Producer prices have been falling for over a year. This is reminiscent of Japan after 1990. When its real estate bubble burst, the country entered what they call the lost decade. Except Japan's decade stretched into 30 years. And now economists are asking, is China going down the Japanese path? Nail number 11. Why this concerns you. Okay, you might say, China is far away. I have enough problems of my own. Why should I care how many empty apartments they have? Because China is the world's second largest economy, 18% of global GDP, the largest trading partner for 120 countries. When China slows down, demand falls for oil, metals, commodities. Russia, Brazil, Australia suffer. Demand falls for luxury goods. European brands suffer. Chinese exports fall. Prices rise on everything from iPhones to IKEA furniture. Chinese company investments fall. Projects around the world stall. Real estate in China accounts for about 30% of the country's GDP. It's the largest sector of the economy. When it falls, the whole world feels it. And one more thing. In 2020, China used more cement in 3 years, 2011-2013, than the US used in the entire 20th century. Think about that. The entire 20th century. 2 world wars, the interstate highway system, the skyscrapers of New York and Chicago, the Hoover Dam. China beat that record in 3 years. When a machine like that stops, you can hear it across the entire planet. Conclusion, what's next? So here's what we have. 70% of Chinese household wealth frozen in real estate, $300 billion in debt at just one company, Evergrande 65+ million vacant apartments, 20 million people paying mortgages for unfinished housing, youth unemployment that the government is hiding, total debt at 300% of GDP, a record for a developing economy deflation reminiscent of 1990s Japan. This isn't a question of if, it's a question of when and how bad. The Chinese government isn't sitting idle. In 2024, they launched a $42 billion program to buy up unsold housing, lowered down payment requirements, eased restrictions on buying second homes. But experts say the real scale of the problem requires $500 billion to $1 trillion. Does China have that kind of money? Yes. Is Xi Jinping willing to spend it? Unknown. One thing is certain. The world we knew, the world of cheap Chinese goods, endless construction, and double-digit growth, that world is ending. What will replace it? Time will tell. Bonus: the alternative universe. All right, let's play a game. Let's imagine an alternate timeline, a universe where China didn't turn real estate into a national religion, where officials weren't promoted for GDP at any cost, where someone in Beijing in 2010 said, "Stop, we're building ghost cities. This is madness." What would China look like today? Buckle up, because this is where it gets really interesting. The turning point, 2010. Remember 2010? China had just surpassed Japan to become the world's second largest economy. The construction boom was in full swing. Local governments were selling land like crazy. Developers were taking out loans like there was no tomorrow. That's when the first journalists started writing about ghost cities. Al Jazeera, BBC, 60 Minutes. And you know what Beijing did? Nothing. Actually, they kept stimulating. After the 2008 financial crisis, China pumped $586 billion into the economy. Most of it went toward construction, more roads, more bridges, more empty apartments. But imagine that in 2010 someone said, "Enough." Imagine China had looked at Singapore. The Singapore miracle that could have happened in China. Let's look at Singapore more closely. In 1960, it was a poor former colony. Slums, squatters, a housing crisis. Sound familiar? But Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew did something China didn't. He created the HDB, Housing and Development Board, a government agency that builds housing, not private developers racking up $300 billion in debt. The government. What happened? 80% of Singaporeans today live in public housing. 90% own their apartments. But here's the key difference. In Singapore, an apartment is a place to live, not an investment. You buy an apartment from the government at a subsidized price. You can sell it after a few years, but only on the secondary market with restrictions. Speculation, nearly impossible. The result? No ghost cities, no 65 million empty apartments, no developers with $300 billion in debt, no 20 million people paying mortgages for thin air, and most importantly, housing remains affordable. A young programmer in Singapore can save up for an apartment in a few years. In China, in Shenzhen, the average apartment costs 43 years of salary. What if China had chosen the Singapore path? Let's imagine. 2010, alternate reality. Beijing looks at the ghost cities and says, "We're on the wrong path." Instead of evaluating officials by GDP, they start evaluating them by quality of life, by how many families actually moved into new apartments, by housing affordability for young people. Instead of letting developers take on unlimited debt, they create government construction agencies modeled on HDB. Instead of encouraging the purchase of second, third, fifth apartments, they impose strict restrictions on speculation. What would today look like? Instead of 65 million empty apartments, housing where people actually live, instead of Tang Ping and Bai Lan, young people who can afford to start families, instead of 70% of savings in concrete, diversified investments, instead of 300% debt to GDP, a sustainable financial system, instead of deflation, healthy consumption. China would still be the world's second largest economy. Maybe GDP growth would have been 1 to 2% lower in the 2010s, but there wouldn't be this ticking time bomb now. The Japanese lesson that China ignored. Now let's look at the other side, at what happens when a bubble bursts. Japan, mid-1889. At the peak of the bubble, the grounds of the Imperial Palace in Tokyo, 1.15 square kilometers, were worth but more than all the real estate in California. The Nikkei index reached 38,157 points on December 29, 1989. And then, in 30 months, Japanese investors lost 2.5 trillion, just vanished. The Nikkei fell from 39,000 to 14,000 by 1991 and kept falling to 8,000. Land prices fell for 20 years straight. They called it the lost decade, then the lost 20 years. Now they talk about the lost 30 years. From 1995 to 2025, Japan's nominal GDP fell from $555 trillion to $427 trillion. Real wages dropped 11%. 30 years, an entire generation. How is China similar to 1990s Japan? Frighteningly similar. A real estate bubble inflated by cheap credit banks that handed out money without regard for risk, a government that ignored the problem for too long, a population that stored its wealth in real estate, deflationary pressure after the bubble started deflating, an aging population. But there are differences. China is poorer than Japan was in 1990. GDP per capita is 18% of America's, Japan's was 150%. China is less open and more authoritarian. It can suppress the crisis by force, but also make it worse. China's population started shrinking. The same year the real estate crisis began. Japan had another 19 years before demographic decline. What could China have done differently, and still can? Japanese economist Richard Koo calls what happened to Japan a balance sheet recession. When asset prices fall, companies and households stop spending and start paying off debt. Even at zero interest rates, no one wants to borrow. The economy enters a deflationary spiral. What could have saved Japan, and what could save China? One acknowledged the problem earlier. Japan pretended everything was fine for years. Banks hid bad loans. The government bailed out zombie companies. China is doing the same thing, hiding unemployment statistics, propping up Evergrande and Country Garden, postponing the inevitable. 2. Redistribute wealth to consumers. In Japan and China, consumption is an abnormally low share of GDP. In a healthy economy, people spend 70-75% of GDP. In China, 53%. Why? Because the money stays with corporations and the government, not with people. If China had directed the trillions spent on empty apartments toward pensions, healthcare, and education, people would spend more. The economy would be healthier. 3. Let inefficient companies die. Japan bailed out zombie companies for decades. The result? Capital got stuck in inefficient projects. China is doing the same with Evergrande. Instead of letting it go bankrupt and redistributing resources, they're buying time. 4. Stop building for the sake of building. Japan's bridges to nowhere became a symbol of pointless stimulus. Government debt rose to 260% of GDP, and the economy still didn't recover. China has already built enough bridges to nowhere. Ghost cities are the Japanese scenario at Chinese scale. Why didn't China choose the right path? This is the key question. The Singapore model was well known, the Japanese lesson too. Economists had been warning about the bubble since 2010. Why didn't Beijing listen? Reason 1, political. Xi Jinping came to power in 2012. His legitimacy rests on economic growth, the Chinese dream, doubling GDP. Slowing construction means slowing growth. Acknowledging the problem means admitting the mistakes of predecessors and his own. Authoritarian systems are bad at admitting mistakes. Reason 2, structural. Local officials depended on land sales. Banks depended on loans to developers. Developers depended on pre-sales. It was a machine that fed millions of people. Stopping it means leaving them without work. Reason 3, ideological. China believed that the state could manage the economy better than the market, that if a bubble inflated, Beijing could simply deflate it, smoothly, in a controlled way. But bubbles don't work like that. Is the window of opportunity still open? Here's what's interesting. In 2020, Beijing finally acknowledged the problem, introduced the 3 red lines policy, restrictions on developer debt. That was the right move, but it was made 10 years too late. The result? Evergrande went bankrupt. Country Garden is on the brink. 20 million families are paying for unfinished housing. What can China do now? Option 1, the Japanese path, bad. Buy time, bail out zombie companies, hide bad loans, hope the problem somehow goes away. Result? 20-30 years of stagnation, lost decades Chinese style. Option 2, shock therapy, painful. Let the bubble burst, bankrupt inefficient developers, write off bad loans, endure a few years of recession, but emerge with a clean balance sheet. This is what South Korea did after the 1997 Asian crisis, painful but quick. Option 3, structural transformation, ideal but difficult. Redirect the economy from investment to consumption, create a social safety net so people aren't afraid to spend, develop the service sector instead of construction. This is what economists have been talking about for 15 years, and what Beijing just can't seem to do. The moral of the alternate history. China could have been Singapore, a country where housing is a right, not speculation. Instead, China risks becoming Japan, a country that lost 30 years trying to climb out of a hole it dug for itself. The difference between these two scenarios comes down to a few decisions made at the right time. Singapore in the 1960s said, housing is for people, not investors. Japan in the 1980s said, prices will rise forever. China in the 2010s said, the same thing Japan did. And here we are. If this video made you think, you know what to do, like subscribe, hit the bell. In the comments tell me, do you think China can get out of this crisis? Or are we watching the beginning of the end of the Chinese miracle? See you in the next video.